Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, a podcast to encourage, educate, and equip you to care for children and youth through adoption, foster, and kinship care. Hosted by an adoptive mom with over 22 years of kinship and adoptive parenting experience. She's on this journey with you. Please welcome Sandra Flach.
But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." That is John chapter 8, verses 6 through 11. I am Sandra Flach. Welcome to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey. I'm grateful that you tuned in today for some encouragement and some community for your parenting journey. Speaking of encouragement, it is hard enough parenting children from hard places, kiddos who've experienced loss and trauma. And on top of that, if you're raising kids who were exposed to alcohol or drugs in utero, it's an especially challenging parenting journey. And that's the journey that I've been on for many, many years. And it can feel isolating. We can feel so alone. Nobody really gets it. Nobody really understands our kids or their behaviors or what we go through. But we're not alone now because we have a whole community of fellow foster and adoptive parents who are also on this journey. And I want to have you check it out.
Sandra Flach, host of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, and FASD educator Debbie Raymond, invite you to join Hope for the FASD Journey, a virtual support community for parents and caregivers raising individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, diagnosed or not. This faith-based support community meets online 3 times each month, features special VIP guests, and a private Facebook group for members only, which includes Soul Care Saturday video devotionals led by Sandra and Deb. Both Sandra and Deb are adoptive moms raising kids with FASD and facilitators of the Facets neurobehavioral model. For details and to register, visit justicefororphansny.org/hope-community. That's justicefororphansny.org/hope-community.
So I hope that you will consider joining our support community. The members all the time share how encouraging and how they just learn so much. We all learn so much from one another. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. If you're not familiar so much with FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it is the leading cause of developmental and learning disabilities worldwide, which I think is mind-blowing for most people who aren't living this. But, the stats also tell us that 1 in 20 school-age kids in the United States have been prenatally exposed. And that is higher than autism. It's much more prevalent than autism, which is like 1 in 36, I believe. So it's way more prevalent just in the general population than anybody realizes, and especially in the foster and adoptive community where there are much higher rates of FASD. But Most of the time it is not diagnosed, or it's misdiagnosed, or I don't even know if I would say misdiagnosed, but just missed, right? Because our kids get all kinds of letter diagnoses, right? Almost always it's ADHD, sometimes it's ODD, RAD, PTSD, sometimes it is an autism diagnosis. And while, those may be accurate, really they may be symptoms of prenatal exposure. Like FASD is really the umbrella where all of the other things come underneath of that. And when we know that and we understand it, and we can learn and understand the impacts of alcohol on the developing brain, and then how the behaviors that we are dealing with as parents caring for our kids, those behaviors are really symptoms of a brain-based condition. It becomes a game changer in our parenting and in our lives, in the lives of our family and the lives of our kiddos. So we really need to know and understand this, because so many of us are struggling. And I'm a mom of 5 adopted kids, and our youngest 2 are diagnosed, and there may be a couple of the other ones that are much older now that we just didn't know what we were dealing with at the time, and they probably had some exposure. But our youngest 2 have fetal alcohol syndrome, and they are now like 18 and a half and almost 21. I can't even believe that my little guys are now like big guys, but I know how difficult this parenting journey can be. And I did not have this kind of support, even though they got accurately diagnosed when they were 6 and 8. We were not offered any information or anything from the developmental pediatrician other than a handout about ADHD. Like, that was it. And back then, when you looked it up online, it was doom and gloom. The outcomes were, kids with this end up in jail, they end up addicted, they end up committing suicide, just terrible things that we were like, that's not going to happen to our family. But there wasn't any hope out there, really. But now there is. There's some fabulous organizations. FASD United is the national organization on FASD. Facets is the organization that I have gotten professional training from, first to help our own family, but then to help those of you out there who are on this journey and may not even realize that's what's going on under your roof. So, check out that support community, because we do not have to go this journey alone. I also offer one-on-one parent coaching. So there's that. And also we have, I offer in-person and online workshops on FASD, which coming up in July. I know we're kind of into July already, and the first one is right around the corner. So if you're listening to this podcast late, you might miss it. But Wednesday, July 10th at 10 a.m. Eastern, I'm offering a free lunch and learn, which is, I call it a lunch and learn because we're having it kind of in the middle of the day. Well, this one's at 10 a.m., so maybe it's a breakfast and learn, right? But it's an introduction to FASD. So if you want to learn a little bit more, it's an excellent place to get started. Maybe you feel like, okay, I already know that stuff, but maybe my kid's grandparents or babysitter or school teacher or Sunday school teacher, youth group leader, whoever, adult siblings, whoever in your kiddo's life would benefit from learning about FASD. That's a great one because it's 1 hour, it's free. They can tune in, they can learn, and they can ask questions at the end. So that's a great one. But if you're looking for something a little bit more in depth, I offer a 3-hour workshop. And these are not recordings, these are live. We use the Zoom platform. So I teach and you get to ask questions. And it's really, we get great feedback on these workshops. So it's 3 hours worth of content. And I use the facets neurobehavioral model as we unpack and learn about how we can apply accommodations and support our kiddos. So that's going on Wednesday, July 24th, also at 10 a.m. Eastern time. So it'll be 10 in the morning on the East Coast. And if you really want to go all in, if you're ready for more, coming up in October, so you've got time to plan for this one, I am offering a deep dive into FASD, again, using the Facets Neurobehavioral Model. It's 18 hours worth of content, but we meet together once a week for 6 weeks, 3 hours each time. And so you can check out that with the dates when that starts in October. And all of those things, everything I just told you about, from the community to the workshops to the coaching, everything is on our website. You just go to justicefororphansny.org, click the training tab at the top of the page, and you will see FASD in the drop down, and click that, and all of the information is there. You can also email me directly if you have questions. And my email address is my name, Sandra Flach, at justicefororphansny.org. And in the show notes for this episode, you can scroll down to the bottom, and there's a link to the website and a link to my email address. So you'll be able to ask questions and find out more when you go there. And of course, before we dive in, because we have a wonderful guest with us today, but before we dive in there, please consider subscribing, following this podcast on your favorite platform. We are also on YouTube at Justice for Orphans on our YouTube page. All of our video podcasts are there. And other, I think we have video on Spotify and Podbean and some other places as well. If you'd like to watch your podcasts, you can do that as well. Leave a review if you are listening through Apple. Leave a review there. When you do all of those things, subscribing, following, reviewing, all of the such, that just shows that algorithm, out there in cyberspace, that this podcast is important and people need to know about it. And then it brings us up higher in the search engine when somebody, we've got a desperate parent needing some help, and they're searching for a podcast about adoption or about foster care. We want to come up in that list at the top of the page there. So when you subscribe and leave a review, that's what happens. It's very impactful. So whether it be this podcast or any podcast that you listen to and love, every podcaster would really appreciate the subscription and the follows and all of that. So anyway, that is all there. Now to our guest. I'm super excited to have with us today, for you, Melissa Pemberton. She is a trauma-aware parent coach, podcaster, and owner of Mending Families, LLC. She has close to 20 years of experience working with families in the child welfare system, from case management to writing home studies to running a foster care nonprofit, and is trained in a variety of trauma-aware curricula. She is married with 4 kids and finds joy in music, reading, spending time with friends, and going on long runs. And we're thrilled to have her here with us today. Please welcome Melissa Pemberton. Hey, Melissa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to be able to chat with you again.
Yeah.
Because I got to be on your show a while back, right?
Yeah.
So it's fun to kind of switch seats, I guess you could say.
I
know. So our listeners can get to know you. Would you share, some of your personal experience? You experienced childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It's really shaped what you do today. So would you share your story with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I didn't realize how important my story was until, recent years. And as I have just grown in who I am as a person through therapy and just through, maturing age, right? You reach a point where you're like, oh, maybe I don't know it all, that I think I just finally realized oh my gosh, I actually went through a lot, and that has that has shaped me and led me to be who I am today. And so I feel like it's important for people to hear that we don't have to be defined by what our childhood was, or the mistakes we made, or the trauma we've experienced. We can actually use that for good. We can actually use that, excuse me, to move forward and help other people. So kind of going back, I was raised in a Christian home. However, my dad had schizophrenia. And so for those of, those listeners that maybe don't understand that fully, it's very up and down chaos. Don't know which dad you're going to get from moment to moment. And coupled on top of that, there were times where he would drink a lot too. So then there'd be that piece of like, not only is he maybe not in his right mind, but he's also very drunk. And as a child, you don't really understand that. So there's a lot of things that I experienced, and along with my sisters. I have two older sisters, so I'm the youngest. That's all I know is my dad having schizophrenia. I don't think there's little moments where I have like memories of good moments, good memories, good times, his laugh. But for the most part, it's scary moments. It's feeling like not sure whether I'm safe or not. And my mom did her best, but she was in survival a lot. I think in my teen years, I was really mad at her. Like, why didn't you do something sooner? Why didn't you protect us? And again, it's one of those where it's like now as I've gotten older, my mom and I have a great relationship. And like, we've talked about this, and I hold like she was doing the best she could with what she had. And she stayed with him far longer than I ever could have. They were married for 17 years, and she really hung in. Like, she truly saw the good in him and wanted so badly to make it work. But at some point it was just not safe anymore. And so, there was just a lot of chaos in my childhood. There was a lot of, trauma that I experienced that no child should have to. And I'm thankful for the adults in my life that were protective, and, my grandparents, some teachers, because I think that those relationships are what then built resilience in me, that as I got older, I was able to kind of use my hard for good. So fast forward, I'm in my teen years. My mom has divorced my dad at this point. And that's a whole thing too, like us having to go to have every other weekend visits with him when like he wasn't a safe person. So my mom is no longer there to like make sure that we're safe. So that was pretty scary. Wow. But we were a little bit older. So I guess the courts or whoever thought it would be okay. I don't know. But I just really was searching for that feeling of like love and filling that hole. So I started out by saying I was raised in a Christian home. And so it was this weird thing where it was like, we're going to church and we are praying before meals and praying before bedtime and going to camp in the summers and doing Awana and all the things. But then at home, it was like, but this doesn't make sense. Like if God is really who he says he is, why isn't he healing my dad? And why is my dad scary? And why isn't God keeping me safe? And, those types of questions. So I definitely strayed in my teen years, and did a lot of, I was promiscuous. I drank. I was just kind of like, screw the world. I'm living for me. Right. And I ended up getting pregnant when I was 18. And so, that was probably the thing that God used to bring me back to him, because although it was still several years, it was through that pregnancy that I started to see what unconditional love was. And my baby was like my priority, and I wanted to keep her safe, and I didn't want her to experience the things I experienced. And I found myself in an abusive marriage with her biological dad. And so it was just like, I was now in this place that my mom was, which is I'm in survival and I'm doing everything I can to protect my baby. And it got to a point where things got really physical while I was holding my daughter. And that was the moment that I was like, what am I doing? What am I doing? And so I left him, and, it's not like, oh, and then things were better. Like, it was still a long road. But that was kind of the catalyst that was like, I got to get back on track. And so I started going back to church. And the thing is, like, for me, it was not necessarily church that brought me back to a relationship with Jesus. It was Jesus, right? And I didn't need the church. I didn't realize at the time that I didn't need the church. I thought, oh no, this is what I'm supposed to do. If I love Jesus, I'm supposed to go to church. But it was like, no, I had this relationship with Jesus that was genuine, and he would speak to me through my quiet time in the morning, and he would lead me to the right Bible verses. The verse I shared with you was, that was one of the ones that was really important to me, because I did feel a lot of judgment, even from the church as a single young mom, that I knew Jesus didn't judge me. And he was like, don't listen to them. You got this. Just keep going forward. So my daughter and I we were on our own for a while until I put myself through graduate school. By this point, I was like, okay, I am going to help other families and kids so that they don't have to experience this. Mm-hmm. So I went into social work, put myself through graduate school, and excuse me, sorry. Right at the end of getting my master's in social work, I met my now husband, because we both worked for Child Protective Services. And it was just like one of those where you're like, yeah, God sent him to me to just like complete our family. And while we were dating, we found out through our conversations, we realized that there was one point where John is my husband, was praying for his future wife. And about the same time, I was praying for an amazing, God-loving husband and dad to my daughter. And so it was just kind of like, I'm getting goosebumps even right now, to be like, God heard both of us, and he said, here you go, and put us together, right? So, so we got married. We had, an immediate, instant family, right? And things were still really hard because I hadn't yet dealt with any of my childhood trauma. And so I just was like, no, I'm good. I got out of it, and I got my master's degree. I know all this stuff, but I just was constantly being triggered and constantly being thrown into fight, flight, freeze. And it wasn't until we had 2 more girls. So then there was 3 girls, and it wasn't until our third daughter was a baby that I had my first full-on panic attack, that I realized, like, oh, I'm not well. And all the while, like, I'm a social worker. I'm working for Child Protective Services. I'm like have a big job of like helping families and children. And yet here I am, like, in survival myself. Obviously, it's not like I was in the same place that the families I was working with were, but also, like, I wasn't healthy. I wasn't well. So it's just interesting to think about that too. Like, when I do have frustrating experiences with social workers at the state, it's like, well, I was probably that frustrating social worker at one point, because I was in denial about my own stuff. And yet I'm trying to tell people how to live there. It just is interesting. But so all that to say, I went to therapy and haven't stopped. So that was probably about 10 years ago that I started therapy for the first time, probably 10 or 11. And have just like continued to grow as a person, and being able to see moments that like Jesus was present in all of it. And I've also been able to like just own my faith for what it is. And I don't need to like follow what this church says or that church says, or I don't need to like do that. Like, you have to do this, that, I just feel like I know Jesus, and he saved me, and he's here with me every moment. And that's all that matters to me right now. Right. Like, I wouldn't be here if he hadn't intervened in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I 2 years ago, I was like, you know what? I am done working with foster care and child protective services and all of this. And I'm going to start my own business and be a family coach and help families learn more about trauma-informed care and help them to better understand, like, there can be a different way to parent that can help you move forward in a positive way while growing attachment and connection. And come to find out, I'm still working with foster parents and adoptive families. So I thought I was done, but the reality is, like, no, these are the people that need to hear this. And, along that way, we did adopt our son as well. So it'll be
Okay.
4 years. Yeah. I kind of am jumping around, but it'll be 4 years, in August that we have that we adopted him. We adopted him when he was 3. And so, yeah, I feel like we're taking it one day at a time, but I just know deep down that, like, this is what I was made for. This is why I was put on this earth, and maybe even why I had to experience some of the things I had to experience. And, it is what it is. Like, I just am able to, it's just, I do EMDR with my therapist right now. And it's just crazy, the things that come up that I'm like, it's mind blowing, I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that was in me or like affecting me in such a big way. And then I feel the difference. I feel that, like, I'm more present, or that I am not triggered by a certain thing anymore. And it just feels like, so freeing to be able to be like, yeah, my childhood was really hard, and it was, just nothing that any child should have to experience. But I am who I am now because of everything. So, I'm just so thankful to be able to give back and help families see that there is a different way. We don't have to parent the way we were parented. We don't have to think that we know it all. We can grow and grow and grow and still have room for growth. And yeah, so.
Yeah. Well, there's so much of your story I want to unpack, but before we get too far from what you just said, because you mentioned EMDR, and just for our listeners who might not know what that is, can you just explain that?
Yeah. So I think it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I think that's what it stands for. And it's just the idea that, with EMDR, you're either like holding paddles that buzz you back, left, right, left, right. I watch a dot, so my eyes kind of follow a screen from left to right, left to right. And it's kind of the best way to describe it is untangling those traumatic memories from the part of your body that feels, or the part of your brain that feels, and it goes into maybe that fight, flight, freeze, from the part of your brain that says, that's not happening right now. That is an old memory, and you're safe now. So it kind of untangles that. And so by following the dot or the paddles, or basically we're going from left brain, right brain, we are untangling that so that we can think about that memory or be reminded of that memory, but it doesn't affect our body in a visceral way. We're not activated like we were before.
Right. So it's a memory. It's not actually happening right now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. Great. So many things to unpack here, like I said. So thank you for explaining that. And then, obviously Jesus is a big part of your healing.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, you wouldn't be here without the Lord, and he saved you, and, me too. And that's a big part of your story, as you've already explained. But we have to deal, whether it's parents, adoptive foster parents, kinship caregivers who haven't experienced trauma themselves, maybe, but raising kiddos who've come through adoption, come through foster care. They've all experienced some level of loss and trauma in order for them to be in our homes. So that has to be dealt with, right? So the trauma has to be dealt with and healed. And I know you mentioned therapy once you began therapy, because you could kind of get away with it for a while, kind of,
Yeah,
sort of, right? But it'll catch up with you
it
sooner
definitely
or
does.
later. It
Yeah.
will. It does, right? So, what role has therapy played in your recovery? Can you kind of share a little bit of that journey for us so parents can get an idea of, what would be helpful with their kiddos?
Yeah. Well, therapy has everyone in our family is in therapy. So, I mean, there's that, right? So for me personally, I didn't even know where to start. So I just went to somebody that my insurance told me, and it was just talk therapy, right? So not just, but it was talk therapy. So we were able to talk through things. She taught me some like mindfulness strategies, but we got to a point where it was like, okay, I am done talking, and I still feel like I'm not where I want to be. And so that's when then I transitioned over to EMDR. And so I ended stuff with her, not in a bad way, but it was like we both agreed, like, this is as far as we're going to go. And I was able to find a new therapist who does EMDR. And I've been with her now for 4 years. So, and EMDR has really been what has allowed me to keep moving forward in healing. So I think that's important for people to hear, is like, there's different modalities and there's not one that is it, right? And so for me, it was like I had to start with talk therapy just to like really start talking about what I experienced, because I'd never really done that. And then move into that EMDR, or just that next step of processing my triggers, right? Same for my kids. Like, we've done play therapy with some kids. We've done, one of my kiddos did talk therapy for a while. And my husband also has found talk therapy helpful. My husband and I are in couples counseling every other week, just because that's necessary. When you're raising kids who have experienced hard, like, it doesn't matter how long you've done your own work, there's always going to be stuff. And so therapy, whether it's each of our individual or a family therapist or a couples therapist, is what then allows us to pull out of those intense moments. And, an example I give to my clients often is, sometimes we're in the middle of a tornado and we can see everything flying around us, but we can't pull ourselves out to be able to, like, okay, this needs to be here and this needs to be here. And this is right. And so for me, therapy is really pulling ourselves out of it to be able to see, like, let's just start with this step right here. And that can then help calm the storm a little bit. So, so I think for our family, that's where therapy has played that role in continuing to help us all move forward in a positive direction in healing, because you're never healed from trauma. You just aren't. So, yeah.
You're just walking through. Is that how you would
Yeah.
describe it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wow, that is great. So, and then after all that you have been through, and you were a social worker and you worked in the child welfare space, and now, like you said, you're back working with families. It's actually what you do, right?
Yeah.
How has the years you worked in foster care, and what was that role? You were a case manager, CPS. What were you doing there? And how has that helped you with working with families today?
Yeah. So I started out as a child welfare worker. So there's the initial worker who does the investigations and maybe removes a child or opens a case. And then it transfers to a long-term worker. So that's what I did for a while, which is helping the family to reunify. And I did that for a while, and then transferred over to the adoptions unit. And so then I worked in the adoptions unit for several years. When we had our third child, that's when I then transitioned into the private side of things. So then I started working foster care, licensing foster homes and adoptive homes through an agency, through a child placing agency, but still very much working with the state, just privately. And that's where I was up until I left 2 years ago when I started this. So all that to say, a majority of my time has been working with foster families who desire to adopt or have adopted. It's hard because I could see in the beginning years where I had this view of like, what is best, what is right. My view of what birth parents were doing or not doing was tainted by my own experiences and traumas, but I wasn't aware of that until I got farther along into my career and I realized like, wait, what are we doing? Like, there's some situations where why did we remove that child? And now this child is blowing out of placement after placement after placement. And maybe they would have been better just with their birth parents. So there's like that piece of it.
Mhm.
And then there's the other piece of like, sometimes I would see adoptive families that didn't get it and weren't willing to get it. And so then they're having these expectations of their kids that are unrealistic. And then the kiddo is like constantly in trouble and it's always the kid's fault. And the kid is doing the best they can, but the parents don't want to see that it might start with them. So there's that piece of it.
Mhm.
And then I saw also like families who really did want to learn and grow and do better and help these kids heal. But then there's the red tape of the state that's like, you can only do what you can do.
Mhm.
So there was like these different paths that were like this, all of this is messy and none of this feels like it is in the child's best interest.
Mhm.
And a lot of this feels like we're actually causing more trauma to these kids than helping them heal from their trauma. And so I think that's what then led me to the point where it's like, I want nothing to do with foster care. And I just want to help families heal from, traumas they've experienced and help kids move forward and help kids find healing. But the reality is like, that's where it has to start, is with those families that are in the trenches doing that work. And I may not agree with like how they feel about birth parents. And I may not agree with, that why they got into it. However, it is the situation that it is. So let's try and do what we can to help this family move forward in healing. Did I answer your question? I don't even know.
Yeah, I'm riveted. I'm riveted here. Because it's so good, because all of the different parts of child welfare that you were involved in really taught you what you needed to know to bring you to what you're
Yeah.
doing today, because you got to see all of those different facets of it. And
Yeah.
where really it's a broken system because,
Yeah.
we have traumatized kids at the heart of it.
Yeah.
And we want kids to experience that healing, and they should never have to experience trauma, but they have.
Yeah.
And now what do we do? And I do agree that parents, adoptive and foster parents, and that was me. I mean, my
Mhm.
husband and I our first, we had 3 biological kids, but then welcomed in a relative, right? So it would be
Mhm.
kinship placement. And because she hadn't been in foster care first, when she came to us, we got legal custody of her. We had zero training when it came to
Yeah.
trauma, attachment, connection, anything. We had nothing, not a
Yeah.
single thing. I didn't even know enough to know I should read some kind of book, because we didn't even
Yeah.
have, we didn't have adoption. We didn't have that mindset at all.
Right.
We were just like, well, she's a relative.
We're going
We're
to
a
help her.
family.
Yep.
We can help her. We're already parents. We know how to do this. And it was, it was hard for many,
Mhm.
many, many years. And we slogged through, and we eventually did adopt her. And then it was eventually the Lord led us to an international adoption. And even, well, so by then I knew, okay, maybe I heard attachment is a thing. So I should read a
Yeah.
book on that. So I did read a book on that. And then somebody told me that, fetal alcohol syndrome is quite common in kids adopted from Eastern Europe, and that's where we were adopting from. So I read a tiny bit about that, but that was just terrible, and so I'm like,
Yeah.
not going to go there. And miraculously, our 3 kids that did come home first, they sort of, they clicked in rather well without any major. I mean, it was crazy, busy, exhausting, but wonderful and
Yeah.
blessed mess, right? But there wasn't yet hard behaviors. And 3 years in, we went back and adopt their youngest sibling. And he was the one that was like the game changer, because he'd been
Yeah.
in the orphanage all 5 years of his life, from
Oh,
birth
wow. Yep.
to when we got him. He, definitely has fetal alcohol syndrome. So we got that crash course in, these big difficult behaviors. And we knew we were not skilled. We didn't have
Yeah.
we needed help. So that's what drove us to, to pursue understanding. We learned, we did the TBRI stuff,
Yeah.
all of that,
Love it.
which helped wonderfully until our boys hit, because the youngest two ended up both getting an FAS diagnosis, and they got diagnosed at 6 and 8, but we got no, the only thing the developmental pediatrician handed us was a piece of paper about ADHD.
Mm,
That was it. And
mhm.
then I do what every one of us, parents, I went online and started to research it. And again, scary,
Yeah.
doom and gloom outcomes.
Yeah.
And I was like, nope, we're just going to dive into this connected parenting stuff that I'm learning about, because that's much more hopeful.
Yeah.
But by
Yeah.
the time they became teenagers, and then you introduce the hormones, and
Yeah.
it became more apparent that there was so much more going on, and we had attachment and we had connection, but there's all this other stuff, right?
Hmm.
So, that's when I began to get that got professional training on the FASD part of it. But you have to, you know, parents, there's not enough education out there, like
No.
really good education, whether it be the FASD stuff, but also the trauma stuff.
Right. Yep.
I do love that about TBRI, because you
Yeah.
do learn you have to deal with your own stuff,
Yeah.
because that definitely comes into play.
Yep.
So it's so important. So I see that, that's what you were recognizing. Like, now you're working with these parents, and all of this all needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
that's the families that I work with. Like, that's the first few sessions is like, we're just looking at what have you been through and what triggers you? And, like, how can we see the history of our child and not just our child's behavior? And how does that affect us? And being mindful of, like, what does your body feel like when your child is doing X, Y, and Z? What is happening inside of you when that, and how can we deal with that, so that then, because our kids are going to feel our energy, and if we're in protective
Yes.
mode, they're going to be in protective mode. So it's all of that. And I wish I would have known that a lot longer, but it is what it is. Like, I know now, and I am just like really on fire about helping other families learn that too. So
Yeah, no, that is great. And describe a little bit the impact that trauma has on individuals and on our families, because we've got, adoptive and foster parents, kinship caregivers who may or may not have dealt with their own stuff. And
yeah,
then on the scene comes the children that we're bringing into our homes, whether, and I like to think that many of us have really good, intentions for becoming adoptive
yeah,
and foster parents. And we know that there's some out there that got into it for all the wrong reasons, but
yeah.
either way, here comes the kids. And now we've added kids who've experienced trauma to the mix. So what is the impact on a family and on each individual in the family, when you bring all of that together?
Well, I mean, I think the important thing to realize is that each person in the family is an individual, and we are shaped by what our experiences are. And
Yeah.
trauma is really like two people can experience the same thing, and they can each respond differently. And it can be a trauma to one person. To another person, it can just be like, oh yeah, that sucked. But like, it doesn't affect them in the same way. So trauma is really the response that our individual bodies have to a big event, whether it's a chronic thing or a one-time, like a car accident, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that's important to remember, is that just because, if, let's use the car accident as an example. Let's say our whole family was in a car accident, and me as mom am like, yeah, that was really hard, but I'm okay. I can't then put that on my kids and say, you're fine. Like, I'm fine. And so you're fine. Right. I have to be able to see that their experience was different than mine.
Mhm.
And the way that their body responds is different than mine. And if I can't see that, then that's something I need to work on, is being able to put myself in a place where I can be mindful of that my response is a different response. So there's that piece is really important. And then we also need to remember that if a child has experienced like chronic abuse, chronic neglect, drug exposure, some of those things, that it affects their whole self. So we're talking, it's the 5 Bs. Let's see if I can remember them: brain, body, behavior, beliefs, and biology. I got them. So all of that, all of those 5 Bs are a part of the child. And so we can't just look at the behaviors. We can't just look at the brain. We have to look at the whole child and say, what do they now believe about themselves because of this? What do they now, how has this affected their brain and their brain development? And maybe their chronological age is one, but their developmental age is another, right? How has this affected the behaviors that we're seeing? What is the need behind this behavior? Because our kids are not just naughty kids. It's all of this. And so looking at that piece is important. I think it's all of that when we do have new kids joining our family, or even if we're at a place where we're finally realizing this chaos doesn't really feel like it should be this much for this long. Maybe we should do something about this. Those are some of the things we want to be looking at.
Yeah. And so how do families, or where should they go to work toward healing? So what kinds of therapies, what should they do?
Yeah. I mean, I always tell families, start with your own therapy. So if you've never been to therapy, there's some good therapists, and then there's some therapists that maybe are not as great. So I would say ask around in your community. If you don't have a community, then you can go to psychology.com, psychologytoday.com. I can't remember. I'm sure you'll look that up though, right? Yeah. And you can put in there, do we want an EMDR therapist? Do we want a virtual therapist? Because I don't really have the time to drive into town and back, right? Are we looking at an internal family systems therapist? There's so many different options, but I think the key is a trauma-informed therapist. A therapist who is trauma-informed. So no matter what the modality is, that's the key. So starting with our own therapy. And then I would say finding resources, whether it's a family coach like what I do, or online trainings, or books, podcasts, anything that has to do with connected parenting or TBRI, trust-based relational interventions, I would say would be the next step. And then, that feels overwhelming. So maybe that's what we do for a while. But eventually, I do think every kiddo needs to be in their own therapy. Every kiddo needs to have their person. And it might ebb and flow. It might be, okay, my kiddo's in therapy for a few years, and now we're going to take a break because it's just too much. But we're going to go back, right? We're never going to be I'm good, I don't need therapy anymore. So that is important. And then also looking at other things, when we do talk about those 5 Bs, the body is one of them. And so we oftentimes see our kiddos who have experienced trauma having sensory needs. And so maybe we need to look into occupational therapy to help meet those sensory needs. So again, we're looking at the whole child and the whole family. So it starts with us though.
Yeah. I love that. And there's also Christian counselors. I think there's some kind of that you can Google also if that's, really what you feel like you want to do. And I know for our listeners who have kiddos with an FASD, it's important to, and it's hard to find people who understand that, but there are some of those out there.
Yeah.
So making sure that you find the right fit. And if it's not a right fit, then go to the next one, right?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah,
you don't have to just stay with somebody because you feel bad. If it's not working for you, say, hey, you know what? This isn't working for me. I'm going to try and find someone else. And that's okay. That's not bad.
Yeah, for sure. Got to find the right person for sure. So, and I know because we've been talking about TBRI, the trust-based relational intervention. So connection, right? And being in a relationship and having those connections is such an important part of the healing process for our kids who've experienced trauma. So can you talk a little bit about that, share about that? Absolutely. Why it's so important? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing is any kind of trauma or harm that's happened in relationship can only be healed through relationship. So that's it, right? That's the big thing that we want to hold on to, because if we have our kiddos coming into our home who have experienced these harms through relationship with their biological families. And maybe we are a biological family too, but whatever home they were being raised in, if there was a harm in that relationship, then that's where we have to focus our time, right? That's where we want to be focused, is healing that through relationship, which is connection. So looking at the attachment cycle and looking at like, what did they miss out on in the first few years of life? And the longer that they were in that harmful situation, that adverse situation, the longer it's going to take for them to build trust with us.
Yeah.
So, in TBRI, they say like, if we have a 6-year-old that experienced adversity for 6 years, it's going to take at minimum half that. So 3 years to get to a place where they do have their trust bank is full, right? That they do feel like they are seen, heard, and valued. And so I think sometimes we as parents just want the quick fix. Like, can you just come in and in the next 90 days, we're going to be better, right? But that's not reality, because the longer that our kiddos have experienced these hard things, the longer it's going to take to pull them out. And connection is what does that.
Yeah. And we have to be intentional about building that trust, right? Disarming fear, building trust, building connection. And I found with my kids, a lot of it was fun, like doing fun, playful things helps to disarm their fear. They start to feel a little bit safe. They begin to build that connection with us. But that's a never ending, always ongoing thing. But we need to be intentional about that as parents. It's a big part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Playfulness is huge. I think that you hit the nail on the head. Like, it really does disarm anything, right? Like if our kiddos are feeling fear or anger or whatever, like playfulness can really help bring that guard down to see like, I'm not upset. I'm not mad. You're not in trouble. Let's get through this. And so, playfulness is big, but it's really hard for some people to be playful. And so, one of the things I say is like, just do 10 minutes at a time, like be playful for 10 minutes. And we can do that. Right. And then we try again tomorrow. And the more we do it, the easier it's going to be.
Yeah. And sometimes it's the little things, because this just reminded me of last night in my kitchen. So our 2 boys that are still home, one is 18 and one is almost 21, which I can't believe. But, the 21-year-old was he's almost 21, right? I don't even want to say that, but anyway, he was making himself something in the kitchen for dinner. But he had a long day at work. He's FASD as well. He was cranky. I think he was hangry, the hangry. And he was like kind of grumping because, I wasn't home to make dinner because I was out with the other kiddo. And I said, I'm so sorry, but now you're making, he was actually cooking himself a steak. So he was, really happy, but still had to gripe a little bit. And then, he was just sort of grumping, and I walked over and I like touched his shoulder like this. And I'm like, I touched you. And he's like, oh, and I like touched him again. He's like, oh, and then he like touched me, and I'm like, I kissed my finger and I touched his cheek. And then he was like, oh, but he was laughing through the whole thing. Yeah. But it's just that, it was a whole 3 minutes or less in the kitchen of this playful interaction, like a teasing, fun, but he was in a much better mood. Yeah. So it's those interactions, but knowing that they need that, even it doesn't even matter how old they are. And even when they're older, they still need that. So important. So, playfulness. So what about some other strategies, some strategies and tools that parents and caregivers can use to build relationship with their kiddos? What are aside from playfulness, what else is there?
Yeah, I think, the idea of shared power is really important. Yeah. And so instead of seeing, I don't remember who said this originally. So this is not me. I am not stealing somebody else's thunder, but I don't know who said it. But it's the idea that we are influencing our kids and not controlling our kids. And so if we can shift that mindset, then it helps us to see like, okay, I'm influencing their behaviors, but I don't need to control their behaviors. Yeah. So let's give them some choices, but those choices need to be preferred. So we're not going to say you can either go to bed now or do what I said. Like those aren't that's not sharing power. Right. And so again, this is where playfulness can come in even here. So playfulness is kind of just like interwoven throughout. But it can even be like, do we want to walk to the bedroom like dinosaurs? Or do you want to, do we want to ride, you want to ride on my back like a horse to the bedroom if we're trying to get them to bed, right? Obviously that's for little kids, but so the choices are, they're both preferred and they're playful and they're fun. And so then our kiddo gets to have that power of choosing how he gets to the bedroom. Another is teaching our kiddos about compromises. And so like our 6-year-old is really good about saying, can I have a compromise? And we may not always be able to give the compromise, but compromises are huge too. Like if I go to Jimmy John's, I'm not gonna, when I order my Club Lulu, I ask for extra bacon and no mayo. So that's a compromise, right? If I'm telling my kiddos, you have to do it my way and you don't get a compromise, then I'm not letting them have a voice. So having a voice, being willing to share power, it's that helping them to feel seen, heard, and valued. Yeah. So slowing down enough to say, what are you trying to tell me right now? What do you need right now? I'm hearing you, right? So, but all kind of interwoven in there is playful moments.
Yeah. And also yeses, right? The power of saying yes. Because I know with our first daughter that came in, like I said, through kinship, we had no training and, she was hard and the behaviors were frustrating. And I just found myself, correcting all the time and consequences constantly. And I didn't feel like I never wanted to say yes. It was like I wasn't, totally she was pushing my buttons, right? I was being triggered. Didn't know any of this back then, but I just, some days it was just like, even when I could have said yes, I was saying no, because I just, there was not connecting.
Yeah.
Doing all of that correcting when, and these guys don't learn from consequences.
No,
right. So then there's that. And when you don't understand that that's a brain thing, it just becomes more frustrating for the parent. So it damages the relationship. So you're not connecting.
Yeah.
But I learned once I learned about, how important saying yeses are, and then realizing, oh my gosh, I just say no all the time.
All the time. Yeah.
Because, I don't even know how to describe it, but I just like, it was like, so there, no, I'm not saying yes to that. I'm saying no, which was really not a right attitude on my part, but it was a game changer because no matter how old, because we hear sometimes, well, this might work on little kids, but it's not going to work on, big kids or teenagers or whatever. But it even works on young adult kids.
Yeah.
So this same daughter, when she was, I think 20, we were doing family portraits and the relationship was strained, but she still came for family portraits and brought her dog, not our family dog, but her dog, which at that time I knew enough by then to know, like, this is causing her a lot of anxiety. It took a lot for her to come to this family function and be in the family portrait. And this dog is really her therapy, like her safe thing. So I let she didn't say, can my dog be in the pictures? But when we lined up, because we were doing pictures outside, the dog was with her. And I never said, and I like consciously noted the dog is there. And you know what? It's okay. And one of my other kids said, Mom, she's got the, and I'm like, it's fine.
It's fine. Yeah.
She needs the dog. So that was like, without actually verbally saying yes, it was a yes.
Yeah.
And it was like money in the bank in that relationship.
Well, and I think that when caregivers hear that for the first time, like, hey, let's try and say yes more, not yes all the time,
right?
But yes more, because then when we're working on accepting no, that feels easier if the no is not happening all the time.
Right.
And the more that our kiddos hear yes, that puts deposits in their trust bank. They feel like they are heard by us. And so oftentimes there's pushback, like, I always have people say, well, what about in this scenario? What would you do in this scenario? How would you deal with this? And it's like, there's always a way to say yes. Not always. Oftentimes there's a way to say yes, even if you need to say no in that moment. So can I have ice cream 5 minutes before dinner? You know what? Dinner is just about ready. If you want to have a few carrot sticks, you can, and then we can pick out what ice cream you want and we'll have that right after dinner. So I said yes to the ice cream. I just didn't say yes to the ice cream before dinner. And the word no never came out of my mouth.
Right.
So there's ways to do it where they're not constantly hearing no. And if we are finding ourselves saying no all the time, why? Like you touched on that. Like,
Yeah.
is it really because it's not what's best for our child, or is it because something in me? Like
Exactly.
maybe it's a fear of like, well, if I say yes, then this is going to happen, and that happened to me, and that was really hard. Like, is it a fear of not letting them repeat something that we went through? Is it just because it's too much and I'm tired and I don't have it in me? Is it because I am, like, is it something in me, or is it really because they need to not do this thing? And again, it's that mindful piece of being mindful of, why am I responding the way I'm responding? And how can I help them feel seen, heard, and valued?
Yeah, it's so important. And then I think of with what I teach with the FASD is, keeping in mind that behaviors are symptoms, right?
Yeah.
There's something more going on. Or think of the iceberg, right? You see a little bit on the surface,
Yeah.
but what's going on underneath?
Mm-hmm.
And when we understand that the behaviors aren't just, intentional, willful, being naughty or bad or whatever, but they're communicating something, and it's oftentimes a symptom. And when we start thinking of it that way, and starting being mindful of, taking their history into consideration, of what does this have to do with their history, or what could this have to do with my child's brain, and how my child's brain is wired because of trauma, but also possibly prenatal exposure.
Yeah. So many things.
Looking at it. Yeah. So important. So important. So I know we could talk forever about all of these things.
I know.
But I know I'm loving it. So, I wanted a quick touch on, and you brought this up because I read the verse at the beginning, where Jesus and the adulterous woman, and he just tells her to go and sin no more. He didn't condemn her. You chose the verse, and you touched on it a little bit, but anything else you want to say, why is that verse so important to you personally?
Yeah, I think for me, it's because I did feel in my childhood a disconnect. There's that piece, right? And so the Jesus that I was raised knowing was not the Jesus in that verse. So there was that piece. And then when I got to know Jesus and I had a relationship with him, and I was feeling some judgment, honestly, mostly from the church, that verse was something I held really tightly to say, judge me all you want. I know my Jesus, and he loves me even when I mess up. Even when, because I'm human and I'm trying to do better and I'm trying to move forward in a positive direction, but Jesus loves me, and you have no right to point your finger at me and say, oh, she's a teenage parent. She's divorced. She's, even when I moved on and met John, was in a better place, I still felt that, from whether it was people close to me or, people in the peripheral, which was like, but you're divorced and you're a single mom and this guy is going to marry. Like, yeah, because Jesus brought us together. Like, I think that's where I have always held that verse to be like, I know that Jesus loves me and that he brought me to where I am today. And that's what matters. And he's going to stand up for me, and he is going to say, don't you dare judge my precious Melissa, because she is doing the best she can. So I can remember reading that verse for the first time when my daughter was probably 3, in the apartment that we called the dirty apartment, because it was like, it was stinky and it didn't feel safe. Anyway, we call it the dirty apartment, which is kind of weird, but that's what we call it. And I can remember sitting at the table and reading that verse for the first time. And it was just like, I've held it ever since then. So 20 plus years.
Yeah. I love that, because we all need to hear that, we as parents, but, and also for our kids too.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you for sharing that. You have a podcast also.
I do.
So tell us about your podcast, because I'm sure our listeners are listening to this and thinking, I want to hear more of what Melissa has to say.
So my podcast is called Mending Families, and it's all about parenting, healing from trauma, learning more about trauma, learning more about how parenting can look if we are caring for kiddos who have experienced adversity. But I also, it's not necessarily just for trauma parents who have experienced trauma or kids with trauma. It's really for any parent, because the reality is when we look at our kids, they've all experienced some sort of adversity. There's nobody who has gotten through life without experiencing some sort of adversity. And so the reality is, like, there's tips and tricks for everyone, but it really is, if you are parenting a child, whether you've adopted or you're doing foster care, or your own biological child, that you have realized, like, yeah, I actually was not the greatest parent to them and I want to do better. That's what Mending Families is for.
Yeah. And that's your website too, because you
Yep.
have your whole business where you do coaching and whatnot. So tell us about what you offer and what your website is.
Yep. So my website is www.mendingfamilieswa.com for Washington, because I'm in Washington State. And I offer parent coaching. I can do in-home services. So if there's families who live in my area, I can do in-home support, but I also can do virtual support. I have an online course that runs several times a year. And I have a monthly membership. So for those who don't live in the area, whether it's the online course or the monthly membership, those are things that anybody can grab and have access to. The monthly membership is one live training every month over Zoom. I send out like content throughout the month just to give people like more things to be thinking about and growing, and whether it's personal about themselves as a person or with their family or their kids. And lots of giveaways, which is always fun, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And, I'm only 2 years in, so I feel like there's going to be more that I'll be offering in the future. But for now, that's what it is. And I love what I do. And I love being able to just help families and see them grow and be able to, from week to week, be like, oh my gosh, yay, we're seeing, improvements. So,
yeah. Oh, love that. So it's Mending Families. WA.com. And we will put, of course, in the show notes for this episode, we will put links to your website and your podcast, so folks can easily find you.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, and like I said, we could chat all day long. But,
I know.
Land in the plane somewhere, but you know that most of our listeners are adoptive parents, foster parents, kinship caregivers. And I always like to wrap up with leaving them some words of encouragement for their parenting journey. So would you do that? Would you share some encouragement?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just take it one day at a time. And if one day at a time feels like too much, 1 hour at a time. It's really hard to, I think, going back to that whole picture, the visual of, if I'm in the middle of a tornado, it's hard to see what's swirling around me and the chaos around me. And so if we can just slow down enough to take it one day at a time and breathe and remember, like, all I have to do is get through today. Tomorrow will come and I will deal with tomorrow. But right now, let's deal with today. Or if that's too much, right now, I'm going to deal with this hour. Or if that's too much, I'm going to deal with this 5 minutes, right? Like, it's baby steps. We cannot jump to the future. We cannot jump to tomorrow even, because it is baby steps. Otherwise we get overwhelmed and we get stuck in that tornado, and we can't see outside of it. So that's my encouragement. It does get better. It's just one day at a time.
One day at a time. Sometimes 1 hour at a time.
Yeah.
Sometimes 5 minutes at a time.
Yep.
So important. Such good encouragement, Melissa. Thank you so much for sharing with us today and for all that you're doing to help support and encourage families.
It's my pleasure. I love it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, wasn't she a gem? I just love talking to Melissa. She has so much important information to share, so much lived experience as well. So I hope that you will check out her website and her podcast. I know we talk a lot about FASD on here as well, and there's some great FASD podcasts. But definitely, as she said, podcasts that are really, connected parenting specific, and hers is one of those. So I hope that you will check that one out as well. So I hope that you were encouraged by my conversation with Melissa Pemberton today. And I hope that you will share what you're learning and share this podcast with your fellow adoptive and fostering friends. We are here to encourage you and equip you for your parenting journey. I've got that lived experience. I'm in the trenches with you, still parenting two young adults, really, who we adopted, who have fetal alcohol syndrome. I know how challenging this parenting journey can be, and that we need resources, and we need community, and we need ongoing training and support. And that's, we're providing that all here. You can go to justicefororphansny.org. Of course, this podcast is a free resource for you. And I hope that you do continue to listen and feel encouraged and equipped through the podcast. But we also have the parent coaching, the FASD support group, and the training, the FASD online and in-person training. So I hope that you will check all of that out on our website, justicefororphansny.org. Check out the show notes, because there's a lot of links in there, as well as a link to my personal website, sandraflach.com, where you can also read my blog there. And be sure to find and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Justice for Orphans. And you can follow me as well, Sandra Flach. I'm on both of those platforms. Love to be connected with you, and I love to have you along on the journey. So until next time, have a great one.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, brought to you by Justice for Orphans. We hope you were encouraged today. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, and share it with your fellow foster and adoptive parent friends so they can be encouraged too. Be sure to find and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Justice for Orphans. And check out our website for vital resources at justicefororphansny.org.